where you see the passing of time,
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's life.
where moments refuse to die,
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
and where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lennon was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then
Go forward, knights, in safety.
and not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
In 1929, the Graf Zeppelin flew around the world with 20 passengers, almost 4 years before the first solo flight around the globe by an airplane. For 12 and a half days, the Graf's passengers dined on gourmet meals, listened to music, and looked out the window as they passed leisurely over regions that no human being had ever seen from the air before. This was airship travel at its peak, an evolutionary voyage that began with a basic balloon and a lot of hot air.
Man tried to fly for 5,000 years before he finally hit on the idea of the balloon.
With no place to go but up in 1783, the Montgolfier brothers created the first balloon that rose under its own power, hot air.
They were constantly going around with sponges and water to put out small fires.
In December of that year, French chemist J.A. Charles made the first manned flight in a balloon filled with hydrogen, a much lighter source of lift.
It was about 7 times lighter than air, and it didn't take much to figure out that that would help support flight, and especially manned flight.
But hydrogen was considered flammable air because it burns furiously, especially when mixed with oxygen. The problem now facing the early aeronauts was how to contain the lighter-than-air, highly flammable hydrogen gas.
Fabric technology had progressed by that time, and they were starting to rubber coat balloons. They found out once you flew, let's go somewhere, we want to fly.
The balloon itself was a pretty limited vehicle. After all, you couldn't steer it. It simply floated to wherever the wind took it.
A handful of aviators believed that the best hope for controlled flight was a motorized, steerable balloon, or dirigible. Among them was a dashing young Brazilian balloonist named Alberto Santos Dumont, who said trying to propel a dirigible balloon through the air is like pushing a candle through a brick wall. In 1884, 2 members of the French Army's Balloon Corps achieved an aeronautical first when they navigated their electric-powered balloon back to its original starting point, against the wind. The 23-minute flight was cut short by the limited life of the engine's 500-pound batteries. Engine weight haunted the airship pioneers. The challenge now was to create a balloon that was not only steerable, but streamlined and strong enough to lift men and machines. By 1897, Santos Dumont began work on his first airship.
Santos made a great leap forward in engine technology using a motorcycle-type motor for his airship, and did some innovative work in propeller design that gave his ship greater efficiency. It was a smaller engine, giving him more lift, available lift for payload or for passengers.
In order to maintain the internal gas pressure of the elongated and egg-shaped balloons, aerial pioneers added ballonets or airbags that expand and contract to compensate for changes in the pressure of the lifting gas. This basic principle is still used in dirigibles or blimps today. Soon the French added a rigid load-bearing keel to the elongated balloon to help distribute the enormous weight of the early electric and steam engines. These semi-rigid airships were quite successful and used as military lookouts.
And then a man by the name of Count Zeppelin came along and said, well, what would happen if we took a whole bunch of balloons and put them together and put a framework around them? And from that was born the Zeppelin airship.
On July 2nd, 1900, a feisty Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin staked his fortune and reputation on a crazy idea. 3 years before the Wright brothers' first flight, the Count's first rigid airship took flight over Lake Constance in southern Germany. It flew for 18 minutes and a distance of 3.5 miles. The LZ-1 for Luftschiff Zeppelin I was 416 feet long, 38.5 feet in diameter, and had a lifting capacity of more than 27,000 pounds. How did he do it? Rather than fill one airbag with hydrogen as his predecessors had, the Count inflated 17 large gas cells and enclosed them in a rigid aerodynamic structure of aluminum alloy or duralumin. The airship was powered by 2 engines with the combined horsepower of a Volkswagen Beetle. At the turn of the century, it was the invention of the internal combustion engine that helped make the Count's dream of a rigid airship a reality. But they were expensive to build.
The German military said if Count Zeppelin can keep his airship in the air for 24 hours endurance, that they would be willing to purchase then his next airship.
During one 24-hour endurance flight, Count von Zeppelin experienced engine trouble and put the airship down near the Daimler Engine Works and went to lunch. It would prove fortuitous.
In the meantime, a storm came and blew the airship away. Most unfortunate for the Count because it didn't fulfill his 24-hour endurance requirement for government sponsorship. But what happened was a spontaneous flood of donations came from the German people to help pay for the next airship. He received about 7.5 million gold marks from the loss of his ship and from all the donations that came in to build the Zeppelin company and to build future airships.
It was a technical marvel. As the Zeppelin began to work the bugs out and began to be used more or less routinely, just before World War I, there was a German Zeppelin commercial service called the Delag.
The different Zeppelins of the Delag were making what we would call joyrides. You have to remember, aviation was totally new, and people really paid for their flights simply to have a bird's eye view of the city or town which they lived in. What's interesting to note, though, is a number of the passengers were not Germans. The enthusiasm of taking a flight on an airship had reached virtually every corner of the world.
By 1914, the Delag airships carried more than 34,000 passengers, over 100,000 miles, without a single accident. It was an economical success. With the start of World War I, the Delag commercial service came to an end, and Zeppelins were used for military purposes.
The Zeppelin was touted as the great secret weapon that was going to revolutionize warfare.
The German rigid airships reigned supreme. Capable of flying above 11,000 feet, they were well out of the range of ground-based anti-aircraft guns, and not a single airship was lost to enemy fire. The German military ordered 26 airships during the first year of the war, and the Zeppelin company went into high gear.
They were producing a rigid airship basically every 2 weeks off of one of the factories somewhere in Germany. It takes 1 million rivets to produce one airship. It also takes 700,000 skins, that is the internal intestines of a cow, to make all the gas bags for one airship. It was a huge wartime effort.
Zeppelins were used by the German military for reconnaissance, as well as bombing raids over Great Britain.
They were above the clouds oftentimes. They did try using radio as a means of navigation, and many a raid took place by a Zeppelin in which the commander would report that he raided this place or that place, and he was nowhere near it. There was no bombing accuracy.
On the other hand, the airships did a large amount of reconnaissance work, basically flying over the sea, watching out for the British Navy.
As the war escalated, the Germans built lighter and lighter airships, capable of operating at an altitude of 20,000 feet. Frustrated by their lack of rigid airship technology, the British concentrated on building fighter planes, capable of climbing to 22,000 feet, and ammunition that could bring the high-flying Zeppelins down.
The thing that really did the airships in during the First World War was the development by the British of the so-called incendiary bullet. A bullet like this hitting an airship filled with hydrogen meant one bullet was all it took to bring an airship down in flames.
It was not the great Zeppelin airships that revolutionized warfare in World War I. Instead, it turned out to be a small, incendiary bullet. In March of 1917, at the age of 78, Count von Zeppelin died. 2 Zeppelins dropped flowers as his coffin was lowered into the earth. At the end of World War I, the great German Zeppelin company was forbidden from building any more airships by the Treaty of Versailles. The remaining Zeppelin airships were to be divided up among the Allies.
But the German airship crews basically destroyed the majority of the airships in their hangars before the treaty went into effect. The airships that the Germans did give over, for example, to the French, they didn't give them the technology as to how to operate them and how to maintain them. That they kept unto themselves.
By 1921, the United States was interested in getting its own airship. They ordered a British-built version of the high-flying German airships, and during the final stress test at sea, the R-38 snapped in two, killing 44 sailors. The airship's light frame buckled under the pressure of high-speed turns. Despite considerable apprehension from the Allies, the United States ordered an airship from the cash-strapped Zeppelin Company as part of war reparations. The ship was to be delivered in 1922. In the meantime, the Americans decided to build their own airship. They would call it the Shenandoah.
During the war, a German Zeppelin came down in France, and the Allies had a chance to inspect it. This was the L-49, and as a result, they generated some drawings. The Navy acquired these drawings and basically built their own Zeppelin in Philadelphia. The technology was very much World War I technology on the Shenandoah. There were some American refinements and improvements, and of course it flew with helium, not hydrogen.
Helium is an inert gas first discovered in a few Texas oil wells. In 1922, the gas was in short supply and very expensive. And even though helium provided less lift than hydrogen, its primary advantage was that it does not burn.
The golden age of airships had begun.
The Shenandoah's first flight from Lakehurst, New Jersey marked the beginning of the era of American rigid airships. Americans were enchanted by the ship's flights around the country. She was hailed as the forerunner to a commercial passenger airship. However, her service was cut short. In 1925, the Shenandoah got caught in a severe Midwest thunderstorm and broke in half. The 210-foot-long forward section carrying 7 men shot up to 10,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Charles Rosendahl figured he could fly what was left of the airship under the same principles as a balloon. By dumping gasoline and valving off helium, he was able to fly what was left of the ship for almost 2 hours before the forward section of the Shenandoah crashed. While badly injured, Rosendahl and his 6 men survived. 14 others died. In October of 1924, Americans were able to get their first look at their second rigid airship, the German-built LZ-126.
This was the state-of-the-art airship design for the 1920s. And the Germans believed it would be the last Zeppelin they would ever build, so they put extra care into its construction.
The LZ-126 was the vision of Dr. Hugo Echner, a business-savvy and cautious Zeppelin pilot who took over the company after Count von Zeppelin's death.
His favorite task was using the Zeppelin as a means of increasing friendship between nations. To him, the Zeppelin provided this means of international trade and commerce.
Echner was a very unique businessman, and that is very evident through the LZ-126, because when the ship was completed and due to make its flight to the United States, no insurance company was willing to take the risk. But he was so sure of the technology of that airship and that the flight would be successful that he said, okay, we will insure the flight ourselves.
But he knew that the whole future of the Zeppelin cause was at stake. He had to deliver that airship. He took the risk and it paid off. But he did land with very few gallons of fuel in his tank.
Upon his arrival in the States, Echner took a leisurely flight over Manhattan before delivering the ship to the Navy base in Lakehurst, New Jersey. The Navy immediately replaced the ship's hydrogen with non-flammable helium and renamed her Los Angeles.
Here I see this thing in front of the hangar coming in. I didn't know what the heck I saw. It was so big. I mean, and it looked like a mountain was floating in there. It was given to the Navy to use for experimental and training purposes. And it wasn't supposed to be used for war purposes or anything like that.
The Los Angeles went on to have a long and distinguished career as a Navy training ship. She flew more than 4,000 hours, the most of any American rigid airship. While the Germans were trying to re-establish a tradition of building rigid airships, the British were having trouble with their designs. Using downed Zeppelins from World War I as models, their technology was dated. Nevertheless, in 1930, the British rolled out one of the most unique airships to date. The R-101 featured promenades and panoramic views. At the last minute, an additional airbag was needed in order to lift the lavish ship.
The British seemed to have a flair for putting on too many things that were not necessary. A ship's bell, for example, that probably weighed 20, 40 pounds. Things like that added up very quickly.
54 passengers boarded the R-101 for her maiden voyage to India. 150 miles from England, the airship crashed in the French countryside, killing 48 people, as well as the British rigid airship program. The American airship program, on the other hand, was about to change. Rich in helium, yet lacking the necessary technology, the Americans went into business with the airship-experienced Germans, forming the Goodyear Zeppelin Company.
Here was an American firm who believed in building Zeppelins. P.W. Litchfield, who was the president of Goodyear, was very much an airship advocate, and he negotiated to acquire the Zeppelin patents. They not only acquired the patent rights, but they acquired 13 of the Zeppelin company's leading technologists, including Dr. Carl Arnstein, who had been one of the chief engineers in the Zeppelin company. He brought these other 12 over. They were known, incidentally, as the 12 Disciples.
They began work immediately on the USS Akron, the most innovative airship of her time.
Construction started in the autumn of 1929, and it was finished by the summer of 1931.
She was a battleship of the sky.
The USS Akron was the first ship, and that was different in that it was designed from the outset to be a flying aircraft carrier. Inside the belly of the airship there was a hangar bay, and it could carry up to 5 biplanes.
They had several planes, but the most famous was the Sparrowhawk, a little bit of a 20-foot wingspan fighter. It would come up, had a hook on the top, and it would hook onto a trapeze bar. From a trapeze it lowered from the ship. It would engage, and then the trapeze would raise the ship up and stow it in a hangar.
And the idea behind this was that the planes could fly out and scout at a much greater distance than the airship alone.
The Akron had 3 reinforced keels and 8 engines capable of driving the ship at nearly 70 miles per hour.
The engines were inside the ship, and a long shaft came out there on the propellers, and you just walked through a door into the engine compartment.
In 1933, after logging more than 1,700 flight hours, the 200-ton airship flew into a storm off the New Jersey coast. It hit the water at full speed. 73 of the 76 men perished. There were no life jackets on board. Barely 2 weeks after the crash of the Akron, her sister ship was completed. The USS Macon was identical, except that she was 8,000 pounds lighter and faster. a fact the new commanding officer found difficult to deal with.
As one senior airship officer remarked to me, he was so careful it was downright embarrassing. And you can't really blame him. I mean, he takes command of a ship, and the preceding ship was destroyed only 2 weeks before.
Built to cruise 10,000 miles without refueling, she's the pride of the Navy.
Using its fighter planes as lookouts, the Macon could patrol almost 129,000 square miles of ocean in a day. In February of 1935, the Macon was lost in severe weather off the coast of California near Point Sur. This time, they had life jackets on board, and all but 2 of the 83 men on board survived.
When the Macon sank, the Navy was not interested enough in wanting to recover or do anything about bringing any of it back up. They figured they'd spent enough money down the drain and had gotten nothing really from it, except wrecks.
On July 8, 1928, the LZ-127, or Graf Zeppelin, was christened by Count von Zeppelin's daughter. Nearly 10 stories high, the ship cleared the hangar door by only 2 feet. With the easing of sanctions imposed by the Versailles Treaty, the Germans were back in the Zeppelin business for themselves. At the helm was Dr. Hugo Echner, the Zeppelin's greatest champion.
This was the period of empire building. The vision of Dr. Echner was to see an intercontinental airship passenger service.
At 775 feet, the Graf Zeppelin was 2.5 football fields long, and in early October, she set out on the first transoceanic voyage by an airship with passengers.
It was designed to prove the airworthiness of rigid airships. That was Dr. Echner's primary concern, because you have to remember, at this time, the early airlines, they were starting to make a name for themselves. And so airships, due to the dangerous nature of hydrogen, due to their size, tended to be still considered as a frail means of transportation. And so the 127 was really a very experimental airship.
Equipped with 2 sets of gas cells, one for engine fuel and another for lifting gas, the Graf Zeppelin arrived safely in the United States. The airship was met with great fanfare as thousands of people flocked to get a glimpse of her. In bold pursuit of his dream of regular commercial transcontinental airship service, Hugo Echner vowed to fly the Graf Zeppelin around the world, not in a fictional 80 days, but in 2 weeks. The trip was projected to cost more than $250,000, money the Zeppelin company didn't have.
As a friend of his once remarked to me, you know, it's remarkable that he kept that company going at the depths of the Depression, particularly in Germany. So he knew how to get money and make money and the like.
So too did newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who immediately offered $150,000 to Echner for the exclusive rights to cover the trip. Incredibly, the rest of the money came from stamp collectors.
Notices would appear even in the New York Times or the papers in this country and everywhere else that the ship was going to make this record flight, and now's your chance, everyone, to get some mail with, with a special stamp on it, carried on the Graf Zeppelin.
The flight of the Graf Zeppelin provided classic newsreel images seen worldwide.
To the magic of motion pictures, you will share with us the thrills and enjoyment of perhaps the greatest aerial venture in all history.
We are now well out over the Atlantic. We are making 80 miles per hour. Inspecting the outer covering of the Zeppelin, this chap makes certain to hold on to that rope.
Several correspondents were on board, busy writing their stories for the Hearst newspapers.
This is the dining room. Comfortable, even luxurious. Worthy of any first-class hotel on land. And now, as we sail, let's listen a while.
England at last. the Graf crossed the Atlantic in a record 42 hours and continued on her way to Germany.
Berlin, where thousands in the streets below rejoice over the Zeppelin's triumph. The land of the rising sun in sight. And now for the unexplored skies of the Pacific. On the first non-stop flight ever made. Most of the time we fly in a strange, uncanny universe with limitless seas of close-packed clouds. Below a world in which time means little, and the ordinary perceptions of distance even less. Our first glimpse of American territory.
Directly over the Golden Gate, the sleek silver airship approaches San Francisco. The Graf flies very, very low over the heart of the city.
Occasionally we are shaken up a bit, but we float safely over the mountains of the great Southwest. What an inspiring view of the grandeur that is America we are getting. A voyage such as we have made is truly not only an education in geography, but a lesson in patriotism. Chicago is giving us as great a thrill as the Zeppelin is giving Chicago. In 12 flying days, we have traveled some 20,000 miles, spanned 2 continents, looked down upon 10 nations, conquered mountains and sea, and here we are, journey's end in sight.
After successfully completing a trip around the world, Dr. Eckner was hailed in New York as a hero and considered one of the most famous men in the world.
These flights have convinced me that the airship has passed the experimental stage.
Indeed it had. The 7,000-mile non-stop flight from Germany to Japan was proof positive for many airship skeptics.
She still had enough fuel on board to make another 2 days in the air. So that means the rigid airship could have almost stayed up in the air non-stop for a week, carrying passengers, and safely.
Soon, Eckner pioneered passenger service to South America.
Only the well-to-do could afford a flight on an airship. The early flights, or these flights to North and South America, cost approximately 1,000 Reichsmark, which was several years' income for a normal German worker at the time. It only took 2.5 days to North America and 3.5 days to South America, non-stop. Even the airplanes from Pan Am were not able to make this type of a trip. It was the fastest means of getting there.
With still more skies to fly, Eckner set off on a scientific expedition to the North Pole in July of 1931. Not only did they bring back information about the Arctic's atmosphere, but the Graf Zeppelin proved she could fly in extreme conditions.
Here again, cold weather didn't affect the operation of the airship at all. And so that was the big success and the big reasoning behind the 127. After that, Eckner could prove and safely say we can start an intercontinental passenger airship service and make it work.
While the Graf Zeppelin ruled the skies, Hitler and the Nazi Party were navigating to rule Germany. If Eckner was to continue building his dream, he would soon have to make a deal with the devil. By 1933, Hitler and the Nazi Party controlled Germany. They also controlled the fate of Dr. Eckner and his dream of intercontinental airship service.
I hope I will be able in about 6 or 7 weeks to take over the new airship to the United States of America.
He was asked at one time to let Hitler speak at a political rally in the German Zeppelin Company hangars at Friedrichshafen, and he refused. Well, you didn't do that and still remain very friendly with the Nazis.
Echner was an outspoken critic of the Nazi Party and was only spared from the concentration camps because of his popularity throughout the world.
Because of the fame that he'd acquired in the trips around the world and the like, the Nazis wanted to make sure they could use Echner for promotional and publicity and propaganda purposes.
Dr. Echner did not like the Nazis. That is very obvious. But on the other hand, he saw the necessity to play with the devil, if you will. And that gave Dr. Echner the funds that he needed to begin his intercontinental airship service.
The deal was this. Echner needed money to build bigger hangars that could house an entire fleet of airships large enough to service the major cities of the world. Hitler agreed to finance Echner's plans and formed an operating company which would control the airships out of Frankfurt. Early in 1936, one of Echner's dream ships became a reality with the unveiling of the Hindenburg, the epitome of everything the Germans had learned about rigid airships. She was the largest airship the world would ever see.
I saw the Hindenburg, and I've never forgotten it. And I don't think anybody else ever did who did see it.
At a length of 804 feet, she was 572 feet longer than a 747 jumbo jet and only 78 feet shorter than the Titanic. She weighed 130 tons and was as high as a 13-story building. The Hindenburg had a gas capacity of more than 7 million cubic feet, the volume of 300 average American homes. She was powered by 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines capable of 1,320 horsepower each. Her aluminum alloy girders laid end-to-end would stretch for 13 miles. To Echner's dismay, however, huge swastikas emblazoned the ship's 105-foot tail fins. And it wasn't long before the Hindenburg and the beloved Graf Zeppelin went to work for the Nazi Party.
The Nazis needed the airships for propaganda purposes with the big swastikas on the tail, and Echner had a fit about that.
Shortly after the Hindenburg was completed, the airships traveled to German cities of 100,000 or more, dropping leaflets promoting Hitler and Nazi Party platforms. They continued to exploit the massive airship for political purposes at the Nazi Party's Congress in Nuremberg and the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. The Nazis replaced Echner as the ship's cautious and conservative captain in favor of a pilot that was more politically acceptable, a move that didn't sit well with Echner when the new pilot damaged the Hindenburg's tail fin.
Echner storms up to Lehmann, who was the captain in command of it at that time, and in a loud voice said, "How could you take our brand new airship out just to please your Lord and Master Adolf Hitler?" As a result, the press people were informed that from henceforth, Echner's name and picture were not ever to be mentioned in the Nazi press again. So he was quite a brave fellow in that respect. When the Hindenburg made its first trip to this country in 1936, Echner was on board, but he had no title and no authority. They went around him, essentially.
Of all the man-made birds that fly, this was the greatest.
The Hindenburg was built above all for intercontinental flight, and eventually that's what she did. In 1936, the airship made 7 scheduled round trips to South America and 10 to North America.
The Hindenburg was the largest man-made thing that ever flew, and it normally flew at altitudes of 1,000 feet or less. Now, when you had something 3 city blocks long, flying directly overhead, making very little noise, it left a tremendous impression.
Just as Echner had imagined, the Hindenburg's passenger accommodation set a new standard in aircraft luxury.
They had every comfort dreamable on board.
Gourmet meals were cooked in an electric kitchen.
The passengers had 2 bunks, or 2 beds in a room. Each room was equipped with hot and cold running water. There was also a shower. There was a writing room, which also had a piano on board. Of course, the piano was out of aluminum, and didn't weigh more than about 40 pounds.
The Hindenburg even had its own special smoking room, which was pressurized to prevent any hydrogen gas from entering the room.
In the smoking room was one lighter, which was shared among all smokers, and you could only smoke within inside that room, which made it, of course, it a very unique airship.
Passengers paid $400 one way to North America and $720 round trip. Filled with highly flammable hydrogen, the crew wore felt booties to prevent even the smallest spark from friction. But attention to the smallest detail would not be enough to prevent Hugo Echner's dream from going up in smoke. Only a handful of reporters were present in 1937 when the Hindenburg made her final approach to the Navy base in Lakehurst, New Jersey. After all, Echner's dream ship had made 17 transcontinental flights the year before. John Iannacone was working that day on the Navy ground crew. He was one of 198 sailors on station and the only military man still alive who saw what happened.
He was supposed to come in at 6 o'clock that morning, but it was 12 hours late. It had been raining and had thunder and lightning, and there were a lot of clouds. Commanding officer of the base wouldn't let them land, and so they just flew around, and then around 6 o'clock they told them to come back because it had started to clear up. In the meantime, the ship got all wet. They were coming in for a landing, and we could see the whole ship from where we were all the time. So they dropped the lines, and the ground crew had a hold of the two nose lines. It was a routine land. Everything was routine. And then all of a sudden, right there in front of the tail, I saw a big red glow inside the ship. And then it broke through the cover and it just burnt.
And it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the men.
I saw one man jump out of the nose, and when it was up there about 400 feet, and he got killed. We saw one man walk out, and he was burnt from the top of his head up to his heels. All he had on was his shoes. When we got to the passenger compartment, I mean, there was people still in it. We told them to get out, and then we started looking around for some more. They wasn't even scratched.
The Hindenburg, which took 4 years to build, was destroyed in approximately 37 seconds.
What was but a moment ago the queen of the air is now a shell of consuming flame, a tragic memory.
On the night of May 6, 1937, the greatest airship ever built lay in a smoldering, twisted heap.
I stood watch on it that night, tried to keep the looters out of it, but you couldn't do it. I mean, everybody's coming in, they want a little piece of this, a little piece of that.
Miraculously, 62 people survived. The Americans and Germans held hearings to investigate the cause of the crash that killed 35.
The Germans said it was sabotage, most of them, because they could not bring themselves to a frame of mind to admit that there could be any deficiency in the airship. Echner was not the same way. I talked to him at some length about what did he, the greatest airship man of all time, think about what destroyed his airship. And he was convinced it made a sharp turn as it approached the mast. He thinks that there was a broken wire that slashed open a gas cell. That hydrogen escaped, caught and collected up inside the ship and started to leak out of it. And that the static electricity in the air was enough to set the thing off.
I believe the Hindenburg crash as such marked the end of the airship as an effective passenger vehicle for intercontinental travel. You have to remember, airplanes had reached that magic point of technologically surpassing, or at least achieving the same thing, even in a shorter period of time, to be truthful, than the airships. So the days of the airship, the ridges, were numbered.
The Hindenburg is no more. But this catastrophe will not dim the vision nor stop the work of the undaunted pioneers.
The Germans completed another ship, virtually a sister ship of the Hindenburg, and it made something on the order of 40 flights in 1938 and 39. But it could never enter commercial service because the United States would not sell it helium. And nobody was going to ride a hydrogen-filled passenger airship again.
With the start of World War II, the Nazis deflated and dismantled the remaining rigid airships. The once peaceful giants of the sky were scrapped and melted down for fighter planes.
The U.S. Navy still was interested in airships, but knew that politically they could never build a really large one again. So they went instead to more blimps, small, non-rigid airships.
A fraction the size of the rigid airships.
Their job was patrolling for U-boats, and their squadrons were based all the way from Canada down along the East Coast to the Gulf Coast, in the Caribbean, down to Brazil, and we flew them to Africa, to the Mediterranean. They escorted something like 70,000 ships, with only 2 lost to an enemy submarine attack.
After the war, Hugo Echner served as a consultant to the Goodyear Company. Prior to his death in 1954, he said, "The Zeppelin has given way to the airplane. A good thing has been replaced by a better." Today, blimps are used primarily for advertising and can still draw the attention of everybody in sight. While their sophisticated mechanics make them much easier to steer than the Zeppelins of the past, blimps are nowhere near the size of the giant airships.
An average blimp has about 100,000 cubic feet of gas, helium nowadays. The Hindenburg had 7.5 million cubic feet. Basically, a blimp today is about the length of the tail of the Hindenburg.
A variety of blimps and tethered balloons are also used for communications platforms, observation, radar, drug interdiction, and border patrols. They are all filled with non-flammable helium and seem to lack the romance, promise, and adventure of the great rigid airships. More than 60 years after the crash of the Hindenburg, the Zeppelin Company is building a revolutionary new airship.
It's called the NT-07. It is a rigid airship in design, although it has very little structure inside.
The new Zeppelin will seat 12 and have a top speed of 90 miles an hour. Due to the airship's mechanical agility, its primary use will be for sightseeing. The advantage of the new Zeppelin is incorporated in its tail thruster unit, which will allow the pilot to control the airship left, right, nose up and nose down at 0 airspeed. This ability will reduce the number of ground crew needed on takeoff and landing. The ship's technical manager is a distant relative of Count von Zeppelin himself. 5 Zeppelins have already been sold for $6.8 million each. The Germans will use the NT-07 for tourism, advertising, and scientific research. The Swiss plan to use the new airship for sightseeing. Another German company plans to build an enormous rigid airship to transport heavy cargo to faraway places.
As far as I see from their plans, if they get away with this, their airship would be even much, much larger than the Hindenburg ever was.
In fact, the planned cargo lifter is 3.5 times the length of a 747 and will have a payload of more than 4 times that of a jumbo jet, or 175 tons. Estimated cost $60 million. Located on a former Soviet military base, work has already begun on the hangar, which will house 2 cargo lifters. The huge airships will utilize solar energy and use 1/10 the fuel of a traditional 747. It seems within the foreseeable future, at least, that we may indeed see the rebirth of the rigid airship, and that prospect holds the same promise as the original Zeppelins. If you are lucky enough to ever see one, you will never forget it.